The Far Drought saga begins here with Galaga 90 on TurboWorks episode 6. We're still in TurboWorks 1989, but NEC and Namco seem to have gotten a little bit ahead of themselves. Maybe Galaga 90 reflects the fact that Galaga years are kind of like automotive model years. Well, whatever the case, the important thing is that Galaga 90 brings together a lot of disparate threads of video game history. For starters, it is, yes, another shooting game on TurboGrafx 16. You know, I just realized that there were no shooting games in the TurboGrafx launch lineup. That's pretty weird to think about, given how shooter-heavy the console's overall library would turn out to be. I can assure you that NEC wasted no time making up for that shortcoming in the following months. Of the 19 titles available for TurboGrafx and Turbo CD by the end of 1989, only 7 of them hail from the shooting world, more than a third of the total library, and all of them ranged from pretty damn good to absolutely great. Galaga 90 here falls into the absolutely great zone. I like to think of Galaga 90 as the Bubble Bobble of the UGSF universe. Not only does it have delightfully cartoonish visuals with rounded enemies that put a slightly cute slant on things, it also contains the subtle complexity of Bubble Bobble. Galaga 90 starts off as a fairly straightforward wave-based single-screen shooter, but the longer you play, the more weird and unexpected secrets you discover. As you venture further into the game, enemies don't simply adopt new patterns and strategies as you'd expect from the original Galaga. They also begin to transform, to change their fundamental nature, to gain new abilities. Oh, and sometimes you might stumble into a section of game that breaks the innate single-screen nature of the Galaga family and transforms, however temporarily, into a scrolling shooter. How do these things transpire? What activates them? I don't actually know. I'm sure I could read a guide and have it all explained to me, but what's the fun of that? Galaga 90 thrives on its mystery. It shines for its ability to drop some new, seemingly random thing on you each time you play. Just as Bubble Bobble becomes a little less interesting once you understand the metagame elements that determine events, like counting coin drops or bubbles fired, I feel like Galaga 90 would become less intriguing if I had a perfect grasp on the whys and wherefores. It's the kind of game that works on multiple levels. People who like to crack mysteries and splay a game wide like it's a spatchcocked chicken can certainly do so, but if you just want to drink in the weirdness and play a shooter that operates with mostly familiar beats but then suddenly hits you with some enemy or event you've never seen before so that it feels fresh each time you restart, Galaga 90 delivers on that front too. God, what a great game. Landing around the same time as all of those other shooters, you'd think Galaga 90 might cause the TurboGrafx 16 library to feel repetitive and samey, but it doesn't. Each of these shooting games has its own style, and Galaga 90 only resembles, say, Fantasy Zone in their shared affinity for cuteness. Even the bonus stages here are fun and whimsical. Instead of appearing as challenging stage, they show up with a proclamation, "That's galactic dancing." And the enemies live up to that billing. While the early iterations consist of the tricky aerial patterns seen in the original Galaga's bonus stages, the enemy maneuvers grow trickier and more erratic the further you advance into the game, all timed to the balletic little tune that plays during the action. You really need to make use of Galaga's iconic double barrel function if you want to have a chance of overcoming these encounters. That means you need to sacrifice a life to add a second ship to battle alongside your fighter, but it's worth it, because who doesn't like to kick ass and take names? Handily, Galaga 90 allows you to activate the double ship function right from the start. You can begin the game one life down by choosing to start the adventure with a second ship docked to your fighter, which may be the ideal way to go. If you somehow manage to snag 3 fighters, they combine to turn your ship into a deadly giant version of itself. Which is cool, but at the same time, it seems like it would be very heartbreaking to take a single hit and lose all 3 of your lives in a single shot. In the original Galaga, it was pretty easy to build up your double fire, since the enemies who made it possible, the flagships, appeared in every wave. Here those opponents show up less frequently, and their appearance varies from stage to stage. So until you memorize each level's patterns, things become a little harder to predict. That's pretty much the Galaga 90 ethos in a nutshell. Like Galaga, but more chaotic. It's probably worth mentioning that Galaga 90 walks back some of the changes that Namco implemented in Galaga's original and largely forgotten sequel, Gaplus. For example, your add-on ships always have to be your own guys here. No more capturing enemies to create a massive fleet of firepower. Which is probably just as well, as Gaplus tends to be a little too easy once you bulk up your side of the battlefield. Galaga 90 seems a little too easy at first, but like the galactic dancing scenes demonstrate, that illusion quickly passes. All the patterns and tactics and enemies of the original Galaga appear here, including the flagship tractor beams and foes who transform and split into three. But the game spreads these elements out across more stages, mixing in new surprises like ships that burst into fireworks, stationary objects that reveal power-ups that drop toward the bottom of the screen Arkanoid style, and double-sized enemy ships, as well as enemies that go far more aggressive with their firing and movements. Add in the optional warps to alternate dimensions, which make the game harder, along with the genre-bending scrolling stages, and you have yourself one hell of a Galaga sequel. Also, it appears that the game has 4 different endings based on which dimension you complete the game in. So maybe it's more like the Puzzle Bobble of the USGF universe, not the Bubble Bobble. Well, whatever comparisons you want to make, it signals great things for the TurboGrafx 16. This is another shooter, yes, but one that plays quite differently from other shooters on the system. This does raise the question of why the TurboGrafx ended up hosting so many shooters, and the answer really boils down to because Japan. Not in the dismissive way that people sometimes say that, which is to say because Japan is so weird. Rather, it's because the PC Engine became a big hit in Japan by catering to trends and interests within the Japanese market. And as we all know, shooters are the true cornerstone of Japanese game history. Once Breakout evolved into Space Invaders, that was it until sometime in the 1990s. Shooters were the thing, especially in arcades. And I would argue that no single console represents a more focused determination to match the arcade experience at home than the PC Engine and TurboGrafx. It seems only natural that the console would embrace the genre that dominated game centers at the time. And let's not forget that Hudson masterminded the console. Sure, NEC actually manufactured the hardware and distributed TurboGrafx in America, but the central driving force behind TurboGrafx 16 and PC Engine was Hudson. Hudson arguably had its first monster hits converting Loadrunner and Raid on Bungling Bay to Famicom, taking a handful of Western works and adapting them for Japanese home consumers. But those successes paled in comparison to the dynasty-building breakout it experienced with top-down shooters. The Famicom conversion of Tekkon's Star Force did crazy numbers for Hudson. The company's own unofficial sequel to that game, Star Soldier, kept the money presses rolling. The Star series launched the Hudson Caravan events that traveled throughout Japan and turned its Meijin team into genuine pop culture celebrities. The company would have been idiots not to build on that success with its own console, especially when the system could handle so many sprites so effortlessly. The TurboGrafx 16 really seems to be a system whose designers built it specifically to host shooters, especially compared to literally everything else on the market at the time of its Japanese debut. Heck, even at the time of its release in the US. Genesis would find its shooter footing in time, but in the early days, the ones you saw on TurboGrafx 16 generally outperformed the Genesis library in a lot of respects. I mean, in fairness, its hardware had matured for a year longer than Sega's by that point, and developers had benefited from more time to get a handle on its workings. Even so, Galaga 90 really drives home the fact that TurboGrafx 16 benefited not only from great capabilities, but also from smart choices in terms of the specific games that developers converted to the system. And there's something to be said for the developers who signed on to work on the console. Namco here being a great example. Namco, of course, had a bit of beef with Nintendo during this period over the fact that the latter demanded the former pay fealty, which is to say, manufacturing and licensing fees for cartridges. Namco disagreed on the grounds that the Famicom may well have never blown up to put Nintendo on top of the console industry, if not for the foundational arcade conversions that Namco propped up the young system with. We can joke around about Xevious, but that Famicom cart, along with the likes of Pac-Man, Galaga, and so forth, put Nintendo's system definitively over and above the competition in its early days. So, for Nintendo to turn around and treat Namco like any other licensee, understandably rankled. But up until the launch of the PC Engine, there weren't really any viable competitors to Famicom in Japan. What was Namco gonna do? Publish on Mark III? So when NEC and Hudson put up a genuine alternative to Famicom, Namco went all in. Well, they kept publishing on Famicom, sure. There was an audience of millions there, so they'd have been idiots to give that up. But you don't have to look twice to realize that Namco's real enthusiasm lay with the TurboGrafx 16. Their newest, most interesting arcade games landed on PC Engine in short order, looking and playing almost arcade perfect. Famicom got plenty of original titles, such as this one forgotten little niche role-playing game called Megami Tensei, and it saw some absolutely wild reinventions of coin-op titles, including a video board game based on the Genji and Heike clans that included a play component in physical space. But you can see a clear divide in Namco's home publishing strategy taking shape right now. Famicom got the home-specific new works, like Mappyland, or ongoing console-focused legacies, like Family Stadium, or radical reinventions of arcade games, like Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti. TurboGrafx 16, on the other hand, got the slick, precision-built arcade conversions. If you wanted RPGs or original console works from Namco on TurboGrafx, you were SOL. But if you, like so many Japanese consumers in the late 80s, just wanted near-perfect conversions of kick-ass arcade hits, well, you knew where to look. Rather than limiting the console's appeal, I'd argue that, at least in Japan, TurboGrafx's specific emphasis on arcade ports helped create a clear delineation of what the two consoles were all about. You can maybe understand why Nintendo didn't cut Hudson out of the Famicom publishing loop once the PC Engine launched. It did totally different things from the other console, offered its own specific appeal, and ultimately complemented Famicom more than it competed with it. This also perhaps explained why Sega's Mega Drive struggled so much in Japan. Its high-spec, arcade-focused design felt a little redundant to the PC Engine, which had debuted a year earlier and became more or less an instant hit. Of course, that same commonality would work against TurboGrafx 16 when it launched against Sega Genesis in America, despite the maturity of its library. Which is to say, that doesn't make Galaga 90 any less awesome. Which is what we were here to talk about in the first place, right? Man, it's so good. Next time on TurboWorks, it's you and me, baby. Head games. Gunhead games, to be specific.